Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. During the month of May of each year, communities across the country celebrate and honor the heritage of Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Americans. The past year has been tough for these communities, particularly because of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19, as well as the spike in crime stemming from hateful rhetoric. Our guests tonight will talk about the different layers of their identity, the barriers they still face daily, and why representation and visibility are so important in schools, the workplace, elected positions, and more. Kicking off our conversation first is Sara Jones, president of InclusionPro. Sara, thanks so much for being here tonight and squeezing us in among all of your speaking engagements.
Thanks, Rosie. It's great to be here.
Sara, at your own comfort level, tell us about your background and who you are. You've got an incredible and unique story about how adoption impacted your life.
Thanks, Rosie. So I've been able to share my story really widely, and I am of Asian descent, but I was adopted to Utah when I was 3 years old. And when I arrived in America, I came to America with a really large tattoo on my left forearm, which was quite a mystery to my adoptive parents. And a couple of years ago, I was able to find my birth family using this tattoo. I posted it on social media, and a few days later, someone contacted me. And having spent my entire life in Utah, it was something that I would never have expected. And I was able to take my family back to Korea a couple of years ago to meet my two brothers and my uncle and my aunt. Unfortunately, my birth father passed away 10 years ago. I will say that I'm so much more emotionally connected to Korea than before, and so it really had such an impact on me and my family.
Wow, I wish we had more time to hear about your story because it's so compelling, but shameless plug, if you want to hear more about Sara's story, it's actually online and you can search her up. As May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, everyone is celebrating and reflecting in different ways. I'd like to hear about your feelings and experiences. What does this month mean to you?
Well, it's probably no surprise that growing up and being raised in a white family, I did not have very much exposure to Asian culture. And so oftentimes, Asian adoptees aren't always thought of when it comes to Asian culture and what this day means, even though it's been around since literally the year that I was adopted. And so most of my communities I'm in, I'm one of the only Asians, and professionally one of the only women. And so it can be a very isolating experience. I am thrilled that there is more exposure, more education now, and more understanding of what Asian experiences are, and more knowledge actually of how to help transracial adoptees better understand and embrace their culture. And you can imagine it can be a very confusing, complex upbringing when you don't have those racial mirrors around you and those role models.
Let's expand on that a little bit more. As a transracial adoptee, you've been very open about sharing your personal experience and raising awareness about this subject. So what would you like our viewers to know about the transracial adoptee experience?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people don't realize how complex the emotions can be, right? You love your adoptive family, but you have maybe feelings of loss, feelings of grief and sorrow, disconnected. You might be wondering where you fit in and finding that acceptance. And also childhood trauma. Researchers are becoming much more aware that it is real, it is impactful, and when children are separated from their families of origin, there are real impacts for children. And so I've been able to talk about what are these impacts and that it's so important to give children safe emotional spaces as they're navigating these complexities. Unfortunately, most people don't know that transracial adoptees experience anxiety, depression, and suicide at 4 times the rate of the normal population. And so these are things that people are becoming much more aware about with the adoptee experience.
I feel like we could dive into that whole subject on its own. Maybe we will in the future. Now, you are the president of InclusionPro, which is a company focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So how should businesses think about inclusion in the workplace, and what are some best leadership practices?
One of the biggest shifts that I've seen over this past year and a half is leaders being much more willing to really jump in and really lead diversity, equity, inclusion efforts in their companies. It has been amazing to see this transformation. As difficult as this past year has been, leaders are stepping up and doing the work. I think the other really big awareness, aha moment that has come to leaders' minds is that we cannot keep our societal events and our workplaces completely separate anymore. There is this younger generation that is savvy, that cares, that is very socially conscious. And they're our workforce, and our future is here now. And so leaders have become much more aware that we have got to be better prepared on how to lead diverse teams, and they're trying to find solutions for that.
Well said. Sarah, we've got about 30 seconds left. I want to squeeze this question in. How can we better support Asians and Pacific Islanders in the workplace and in the community?
I would encourage everyone to be thoughtful about the stereotypes that are applied to Asians. Oftentimes it's so easy to assume Asians are doing fine, but if you look at the data, Asians are highly underrepresented in leadership. I mean, we are almost 7% of the population. Asian women on corporate boards only hold 1% of board seats. And so follow the data and make sure you're not just assuming that Asians are making it into leadership, making it into positions, career positions. Be very thoughtful and intentional about seeing a wide range of talent.
Well said. You've been hearing from Sara Jones, president of InclusionPro. Sarah, we are honored to have you part of this conversation tonight. Thank you so much for making time to be here.
Thanks for having me, Rosie.
We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Joining us next is Poonam Kumar, a community advocate in Poonam. It is such an honor to have you here tonight. Welcome to the show.
Rosie, thank you so much for having me.
Poonam, as May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, I'm asking everyone this question, but everyone's celebrating and reflecting, right, in different ways. I'd like to hear about your feelings and experiences. What does this month mean to you?
Absolutely. Well, this is such a beautiful time for us to get out and celebrate with our families and our communities. But for me personally, this is a time where I'm taking a moment to really reflect and think about my family who immigrated here and their stories, right? Their pursuit of the American dream. But I also think about my husband too and his family who fled as refugees from Cambodia. And so when you think about AAPI, or the Asian American and Pacific Islander experience, it's very broad. And so you've got these two stories of immigration and we've got, communities that have fled here as refugees. And so when I think about this month, it's really taking a moment to step back and really honor those that came before us, but also those that have created a path forward for us as well.
I love that. So Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Americans are not a monolith, right? Nor are any other ethnic groups. What have been your personal experiences and thoughts with this subject?
Absolutely, and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, we are not a monolith. Our communities, where we come from, ranges from many countries and locations around the world. And so when I think about, for example, my own family, how we define our story is so different. I might ask my dad, how do you define your ethnicity? And he'll say, I'm Fijian. My brother might say South Asian, and my sister might say Indian. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that story, Rosie. So for me, as I define myself, if I'm asked, what my ethnicity is, I always start off and I say I'm first American because, I was born and raised in this country. English is my first language. This is home to me. And so first and foremost, I'm American. Secondly, I say that I'm Indo-Pacific, meaning my motherland, my homeland of my ancestors is from India. And when the British colonized in India, my family went as indentured laborers to the Fiji Islands, which is where my family's homeland is in Fiji. And so that kind of tells my story, my migrational story of being American Indo-Pacific Islander. And so many of our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities have these stories to tell. And so this is a month where we get to honor and hear those stories.
Well said, that intersectionality of multiple layers of our identity, right? Although both you and I were born and raised in the U.S., we continuously deal with this concept of otherness. First off, how would you explain otherness to someone who doesn't know? And what are some examples of when you've been made to feel othered?
Absolutely. And you know, the term otherness can often be described as sort of a dichotomy between us and them. And how I sort of see it is, you know, the sort of comparison of who is sort of the dominant, and who else is not the dominant is considered the so-called other. And so in my experiences, and I have a quick little example, you know, many moons ago, I went to a store and I was checking out, and the person that was checking me out had asked me, "Where are you from?" And I answered, I was like, "Well, I'm from Centerville, Utah." And then she was curious, so she followed up and she said, "No, really, where are you from?" And so I sort of took a step back and I said, you know, okay, you got me there. I'm from Los Angeles, California, born and raised. And she ended up following up with that, saying, you know, knowing that I wasn't really quite giving her the answer that she may have wanted, she'd asked me, where are your parents from? And so at that point, I kind of gave her my story, my migrational pattern of where my ancestors, my parents are from, and then where I was born and raised. And so what I find was very interesting about that sort of otherness was that when I turned around and I asked this individual that same question, she wasn't able to answer, and she sort of made the comment, you know, I'll have to dig in a little bit deeper. And so I think that this happens to a lot of Black, Indigenous, people of color often. Because of the way we look, we tend to be considered the other. And so we may get asked that question of, where are you from? No, really, where are you from? And we have to really prove our existence here in this country, whether you have citizenship or not. Whether you speak English as your first language, you have an accent or not. And so these are some things where we need to pull back the layers during this month to really think about how can we really understand and get to know people better. And so I really kind of challenge the folks out there, if you do tend to ask this question, I know it comes from a good place, but I really think that if you can also be able to answer that same question, where are you from, and be able to flip it on yourself too, it makes for an amazing dialogue and conversation about our cultures and where we come from and how we are American today.
Wow, well said. Definitely during this month is not just a reflection for us, right, as Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Americans, but for our white counterparts and everybody else who are in our communities. Poonam, we've got about 30 seconds left. I wonder if we could squeeze in this last question. I'm so interested in hearing about this from you. We've seen a spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans this past year because of harmful rhetoric related to COVID-19. But if we look at this issue from a historical viewpoint, this isn't the first time hateful rhetoric and behavior reached a boiling point in the U.S. I'm thinking of post 9/11, right? For South Asians, Sikhs, and Muslims. Let's hear your take on this.
Absolutely. This was a very scary time post 9/11, and right now many of our Asian American community members are seeing and feeling this post COVID-19, and the anti-Asian hate and violence. This is not a new thing in this country. This has been around for quite some time, and so it's almost like a pendulum swinging back and forth, whether it be, you know, the East Asian community, Southeast Asian community, our Pacific Islander community. There's just so many things that are happening. And so back to sort of the 9/11 instance, I remember my family living in so much fear after that moment, being afraid to let, you know, my siblings and I be like playing outside during school, or you know, being able to go out and wear our traditional attire, having this sort of fear and trying to be under the radar so that we wouldn't be in a place where, you know, we could be attacked. And for many of our Muslim and our Middle Eastern and our Sikh community, like being so fearful of what is happening out and about and not knowing if you can go to your place of worship and be safe. And so right now I put a call to action out there for the community, you know, what our Asian American and Pacific Islander community need in a moment like this, when it is a scary time out there, is to really have that community support and being able to know that there's safety and community out there for them.
Yeah, and it just shows that this doesn't end, right? We've been dealing with this for decades and centuries. So a lot to think about here tonight. All right, you've been hearing from Poonam Kumar, a community advocate. And Poonam, I know we've only brushed the surface of this conversation, and you and I could talk for hours about this subject. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really enjoyed hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Rosie.
We'll be right back. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Joining us last but not least is Ofa Matangi, chair of the AAPI Democratic Caucus. And Ofa, I know you're a busy woman, so we appreciate you making time for us. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Rosie. I'm excited to be here.
Now, Ofa, as May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, everyone is celebrating and reflecting in different ways. I've asked our last two guests this question. I'd like to hear about your feelings and experiences. What does this month mean to you?
You know, kind of just echoing off of what the other two had shared with us today is that, you know, it's a month of reflection, which I think is key. You know, we're not really able to move forward and progress as a community if we don't know where we've been, right? The things that we've overcome and the impacts that we've had on society. And so I think that's a key component of that. But also more to that is present day. What are we doing today to be able to actively move forward in this work of elevating and empowering AAPI, not just in the state of Utah, but across our country? And so, you know, Asian American Pacific Islanders is such a varied group. There's so many ethnicities within that, and so it's kind of complicated to pinpoint exactly what that looks like. But, you know, I think just being able, again, to be able to look at where we've come in regards to policy. You know, the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, was the first of its kind here in our country. The banning a particular race, you know, coming here, and then from that spurs on this ongoing conversation about immigration reform, and then even going into social impacts, you know, the study of ethnic studies that came about from the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s. And today, even here in Utah, if for those who have been, you know, keeping up with what's happening interim-wise up at the Hill and the critical race theory and how that very much is associated with each other, and being able to have these important conversations and studies in our curriculum with kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. And so it's important to know where we've come from, but to also be able to project and see where can we go from here.
Now, earlier we talked about why representation and visibility is so important in places like the workplace and schools, but it's also important in elected positions. And this is something that you have personal experience with. I'd like to kind of dive into this and talk about how you have strived to add more representation in our political realm. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, thank you, Rosie. Great question. You know, growing up, I was born and raised in Utah. My parents migrated here when there was an influx of Pacific Islanders moving here to parts of West Valley and so forth on the west side. And I didn't really see anyone who looked like me in the community, more so anyone who looked like me serving in elected positions and positions of leadership and influence. And so, you know, I had seen Olene Walker, of course, become governor after moving from lieutenant governor to governor after Leavitt had left. And for me, I said, okay, Dad, like there's someone there, you know, here's a woman, maybe she's not Pacific Islander, but being able to see that momentum and see that the visibility. Visibility is so important to be able to see others who look like you, who are serving in those spaces. And so for me, you know, after seeing a phenomenal friend of mine, Beverly Weepy, who's the one of the councilwomen for Mill Creek, you know, I said, you know, why not me? Why can't I also be able to step up and serve my community for House District 33, West Valley City at that time, and then took that leap of faith and, you know, got involved in different candidate trainings and really wanted to be able to be a visible leader to show other people, other Pacific Islanders specifically, that women have a place and that Pacific Islanders have a place in the policies that are made at a judicial or at a legislative level.
I absolutely love that. I feel like you got into politics for the same reason why I got into journalism. And so everything that you said in that last answer, I share those same sentiments as you. Ofa, we have about a minute left. I really want to get to this question. There's been some conversations, right, around the nuances with the acronym AAPI as it groups two distinct ethnic groups together as a whole. And this is a topic that we will dive a little bit deeper into a later show, but for now, for the sake of limited time in this conversation and to end the discussion on a positive note, how do we, as AAPI, work collaboratively to create unity, but also recognize the distinct uniqueness of the varied ethnicities within?
Right, and exactly as you stated, Rosie, it is so complex. There's multiple races races and ethnicities within Asian American Pacific Islander. And a lot of the sentiments that I've heard, because I've been going around, telling people I'm excited, it's Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and many Pacific Islander, people were dismayed to an extent as they feel like their voices and their experiences haven't been represented in spaces that purport having a mission that's inclusive of AAPI. And so I strongly suggest for those who are Asian American Pacific Islander organizations to really be able to connect with those in the community that are doing that work specifically with Pacific Islanders and be able to create those spaces where we can work together collaboratively. We have phenomenal organizations here in Utah like NTAS, National Tongan American Society, UPASEC, Utah Pacific Islander Civic Engagement Coalition, and UPIC, Utah Pacific Islander Health Coalition. And so there's so many organizations out there. I think if we are able to pull our resources together to make those relationships and connect, we can see a more collective and collaborative future for all AAPI.
And just reach out. I mean, OFA is also a community leader here who is always, her inbox is always open, right, for anyone who is looking to make these connections and whatnot. Everybody on this show is. You've been hearing from Ofa Matangi, chair of the AAPI Democratic Caucus. Ofa, thank you so much for being here tonight and rounding out our conversation. We appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much.